to the first row. Good afternoon, Mr. President. Well, that will be my sound. My volume will be a bit muted or mixed or dampened. You said that you will tell us a word about the economic development. So this past 2 years, we have been waging a global war against COVID, and now it's going to be a war against Omicron. So how that impacted the economy of our country, and how can we get out of that pit? Are there any enablers or drivers? And do we have to expect our in for a full vaccination to provide for the successful economic development? And the main question to you, of course, is how you assess the work of the economic headquarters, which is the government, as well as the central bank. And I have just mentioned the central bank, and I just have recalled that I quite often asked you questions about the central banks, but this is a mere coincidence. Thank you. Well, if I take all your questions, I think, well, if I am able to do that, I think that will bring the press conference to an end and will last through the press conference, because they are overarching, they're quite general, and they encompass the main areas of our activities. You have said that the world has been in warfare against COVID, and that is still ongoing, and we know about the dangers of the spread of the Omicron strain. But I really hope that we will talk that during today's press conf. As you know, a group of our doctors and medics is now in the South African Republic, where the strain originates from. And this undertaking is successful, a special thanks to the South African colleagues. Well, with respect to the impact on the Russian economy and what we expect in near future, well, we also talked a lot about that, and definitely our economy being faced off with the COVID challenge and the forced restrictions in our economy and the social sphere, and I will talk about that at length today. So still, we turned kinda more mobilized and prepared for such shocks than many other developed and advanced economies. If you take 5-7 leading economies or even G20, our economy fell by around 3%, which is much better than other leading economies, and we recovered at a much faster pace, and you know the figures. Last year we could speak about the nascent trends, and now I have a chart in front of me with some numbers. Not to invent things, the GDP growth is expected at 4.5% this year. As of October, it was 4.3. The industrial output increases by 5%, and the processing industries by 5.2%. The crops of grains this year are a bit below the previous levels, 123 million tons versus 135 last year. That is a very good outcome, and will be self-sufficient and will have a lot of capability for exports. The fixed investments are at 7.6% as of November, and as of 2021 we'll have a 6% rise. Last year we had a slump of 1.4, and our construction has been doing quite well. 90 million of new square meters built for the first time ever in our news history. And I'd like to congratulate all the construction workers, all the personnel, the construction personnel, and the managers and everybody. The real salary take-home pay, average take-home pay, has started growing, and the real disposable incomes are now on the rise. Last year we had -2%, and this year we expect a growth, and definitely we'll talk inflation, and inflation is at 8% as we project, which is much more than previously expected. But anyway, the real salary growth is around 4.1% as of 2021. The real income will increase by 5.3%. Definitely this is the average indicators. Well, we do have, for the sake of statistics, to handle average values and numbers, to have some benchmarks, and we'll talk our incomes and livelihoods in greater detail. The unemployment rates. Our target was to return to the pre-pandemic levels, but now we have our unemployment lower than we had before. We had 4.6 to 4.7% of unemployment. Now it's 4.3 or 4.4% in 2021, which is a very good parameter of the overall economic performance. Although some of the hardships arise with respect to the labor market, and the number of the people employed on construction sites and in the construction sector. So the trade account is now last year was at 24 billion of surplus, and this year the trade account will be 184. The foreign debt has gone down slightly to around 4%, which is one of the lowest parameters worldwide. Other important numbers that testify to the performance of the government, the central bank, and the state per se. The international reserves was at 595 billion USD. Now it is at 625. And the National Welfare Fund is at 185 billion USD, which speaks about the good macroeconomic performance and the sustainability of our economy. And what worries us is the life expectancy. It was 71.5 years, and now the life expectancy has gone down slightly to 71 years, which probably is accounted for partly by the pandemic of COVID. So more or less it is like this. And I think that the work of the government and the central bank deserves, well, a satisfactory mark, a satisfactory grade. The results are positive. So now, with respect to the growth drivers and enablers and the vaccination, whether we need a sweeping vaccination or not, well, we have talked about those growth drivers a lot with respect to our specific situation in this country, starting from the post-war period since the end of World War II in 1945. I mean, the challenges and the drivers that we face. I've just talked about greater mortality rates and lower life expectancy. And in this respect, one of the main problems, main goals of ours is aggravating. I mean, the demographics from the humanitarian standpoint and from the geopolitical standpoint, the population 146 million for this vast and huge territory is insufficient, and economics-wise, we lack the manpower. Now we have 81-something million of the working age people, and we are to increase that considerably by 2024 to 2030. That will be one of the economic growth enablers, and I underscore the geopolitical component and the humanitarian dimension. So saving our people, which the famous writer Solzhenitsyn told us about is one of the overarching goals of ours. Besides, and apart from that, we should develop our infrastructure, and we have been taking strenuous efforts in this respect. You know that 500 billion was earmarked out of the federal budget to improve our infrastructure directly. Then within the national projects, we put up to 160 billion, then 400, and next year it's going to be 460 billion more. From the National Welfare Fund, we will spend 2.5 trillion rubles in the forthcoming years. We'll put that up in infrastructure. And the third growth driver would be improving our labor productivity, which can be broken down in education measures, digitalization, and healthcare initiatives, and a number of programs that we have in the pipeline. We know what to do. We have designed all of them, and the funds are stipulated, and we have them. We will be progressively disbursing funds, and what we need is the maximum return from each ruble that we invest. And then another question of yours about the sweeping vaccination. Well, like in many other countries, unfortunately, let's take Europe. They, like in Germany, for example, they are concerned about the low levels of vaccination, although this health care system of theirs is savaged by critiques, but still they have a low level. Ours is 59.4%. I mean, the vaccination rate. I learned that yesterday. I knew last night is going to be one of the main topics of our meeting, and I talked with Madam Popova and Madam Golikova. 59.4% is the herd immunity in this country, which includes those previously infected and those vaccinated. And we have around 70 million people with the first jab, and quite a considerable number with 2 jabs, but that is insufficient. We need to reach the herd immunity at around 80%. I hope that next year, in late first quarter or in the second quarter, we'll accomplish that. In some countries, they speak that the herd immunity should stand at 90 to 95%. Well, it is more or less like this. Thank you. We continue. Let's take our major news agencies. The TASS Newswire. A very good day. TASS Newswire. Veronika Chotkina is my name. I'd like to follow up on that topic and speak about this welfare spending. Of late, the government has stepped these expenditures up, and judging by the recently approved budget for the forthcoming 3 years, this will be the trend. And not long ago, there was a discussion about curbing the social spending next year. Will you comment on that, on those claims, and what would be your characteristic of the new budget? Is it going to be a development budget or a welfare-centered budget? Let me finish just a second. And whether it is possible to further increase the social spending amid the pandemic. If that is to happen, have you assessed any possible risks of losing control over the inflation, which has been soaring? Well, the budget quality and budget characteristic of mine, well, it is definitely a welfare-centered budget. Yesterday we talked about that with the colleagues from the government. If we take the healthcare and welfare spending, the healthcare federal expenses and the mandatory medical insurance in the regional budgets. They spend around 1.5 to 1.7 trillion rubles on healthcare. So it is an obvious growth, and I recall that we planned to have 3.6 trillion rubles of spending on healthcare from two sources. I mean, the federal appropriations and the mandatory medical insurance spending. And this year we'll have around 3.9 to 4 trillion. Next year we plan to have 4 trillion, but I'm sure we'll have more. These are real numbers, and that does not include the regional spending, which fluctuates around 1.6 to 1.7 trillion of rubles per annum, which is quite a hefty deal of subsidies. With respect to the welfare, definitely we'll also have growth in this sphere.
Even under the conditions of the pandemic, when we were building up the work to support the most vulnerable and damaged areas of the economy and the industries, we are talking about enormous figures of 4.5% of the national GDP last year, and this year it is almost 1% of the GDP, which means almost 5.5% of the GDP in total. This is not just about allocating the money. This is about the economy in general. Even with the support of the damaged industries, we were always aspiring to save the jobs. We're doing everything to support the people with low income, the vulnerable groups of people, namely the young families, families with children. I can move on very long talking about that, but let me give you another few groups. You know all of them. We have expanded the number of families who are receiving the social support from the state. Simply the number of families has increased, those who have children from 0 to 3 years old. Besides, we have also started to pay the family capital social support for the families who have their first child. We also pay benefits for the pregnant women who are in a vulnerable social situation. We are paying additional funds for the families with children aged from 3 to 7, and we're also making single-time payments of 5 or 10,000 rubles for various categories of citizens. First of all, we're talking about the people who are financially vulnerable. This is an entire number of tools and measures that we're employing. 4.5 trillion rubles last year was allocated for that, and this year we have continued a number of measures aimed at the same goal. The main goal, let me reiterate, is to support the people directly or support them through the businesses. The businesses are getting the money only if they can save the jobs and if they can retain a certain level of wages. Besides, we have increased the minimal wages and the minimum livelihood payments, and the increase might seem rather modest, but the whole meaning is to improve and increase the social benefits, which affects millions of people, since the minimal payment is defining the social benefit sums, and this also reflects on the indexation of the retirement benefits. So there is absolutely no doubt that our national budget is socially oriented. Right now, answering the question from your colleague, speaking of the drivers for the economic growth, I mentioned the absolutely unprecedented plans on the infrastructural development. And see the enormous resources that we're allocating. The National Welfare Fund is allocating 2.5 trillion. 500 billion have already been allocated, and next year we will allocate additional 460 billion. We're improving the productivity, the efficiency. We're digitizing the economy almost in all of the industries. We're allocating great funds for this end, and sure, our budget is absolutely social, aimed at the continued development of the country. This is absolutely obvious if we take a look at the figures. Thank you. Yes, please. I would like to precise and specify one more thing. I was asking if the growth of the social expenditure would affect the inflation. Yes, I forgot about that, sorry. You're absolutely right to say that this is one of the key issues in the area of sustaining the macroeconomic stability of the country, since many leading economies of the world are changing their macroeconomic policy and significantly increasing the intensity of money printing. These are obvious things, and therefore this results in great inflation figures in the leading world economies, which is obvious and apparent for everyone. These are the figures that we're all aware of. The budget deficits are on the rise in all of the leading economies, including the United States, with a bit higher figures and slightly lower in the Eurozone, but still they have significant figures for inflation which are uncharacteristic of them. But if we take a look at the world's leading economy, the United States of America, they have 6.1 or 6.2% of inflation, while their target inflation is 2%. This means a threefold increase over the target inflation rate. In Russia, it's also large, 8%. Our target was 4%, which means a twofold increase compared to the target inflation. They have a threefold increase. This is quite serious, and I believe the Federal Reserve will have to do something about that. Their monetary policy is affecting the macroeconomics, and finally, it nullifies and cancels out the good and noble goals that they're using, including the support of the economy and the support of the country's citizens. This also exists in Russia, since 8% is a large figure, and naturally we need to come back to the target goal of 4%. Sure, we can blame the central bank, and I'm staying in constant contact with our colleagues from the real sector of the economy, from the production, and I know how they're blaming the central bank. I'm aware of their arguments. I see and hear it almost every day. And you see this on the TV, and people come to me sitting 3 meters from me, and this is only a small share of the entirety of my contacts, which is not shown on camera or on television. I see this and hear this every day. I meet people, I hold sessions and discussions. Some people are staying further away, so you can't see that. But we are talking about this every day, and I am well aware of the dissatisfaction of the real sector from the changing rates. But if we don't do that, we might end up like Turkey. This is the problem. And this is a serious matter and a serious challenge. Naturally, we need to be very careful when we use this tool, but the central bank is conducting an independent policy. This might seem weird, but I do not interfere in the work of the central bank, but I am positive about its work. And I believe that overall we're trying to find the golden middle, the balance between the increase of rates and the threats which might arise from that, which means the decrease of the growth rate. We need to have 3.4, 3.5% of the growth rate in the upcoming future. Now we have 4.6% of the growth. We need 4.5%. This would be good. But the increased rates are limiting the possibilities for growth. But so far we haven't seen that, since the loan volume is not decreasing and the banking system is growing. Sberbank is getting trillions of revenue. So this is why, so far, the golden middle ground has been found. Let us continue with the third major agency, RIA News. Please, the mic for RIA News agency in the central sector. Please turn around. Hello, Helena Glushakova, RIA News agency. Thank you. You've just been talking about social support, but another important aspect is the business aspect. Where do you think is the balance between the restrictive anti-COVID measures and the need to save the economy, since the restrictions are often damaging for the large and small businesses, the retail and small restaurants and cafes, small shops, the cinema industry, movie industry and entertainment? And another related question, what is your opinion on the work of the regional authorities who, during the pandemic, have received very wide competencies and used them differently while introducing various kinds of restrictions? In your view, were they successful in this work, and how would you evaluate their work? All right. First of all, speaking of the businesses and the support for that, you said that it was damaging the large business and small business alike. Well, small business is taking most of the damage in this case. Sure, there are certain negative aspects in the work of large industries. We have also elaborated certain support measures for these industries and businesses. All the leading industries have received support. The large businesses received 8 packages, which was my request at the beginning of last year, and the government actually did that. They adopted a number of measures which were quite beneficial for our large industries and businesses, the holdings. And they worked quite well without any problems, and in some cases they even managed to increase their production volumes. Speaking of the defense industry, they have also increased their production. Speaking of the small and medium-sized enterprises, we know that we're talking about the restaurants, cafes, the fitness halls, the cinemas, and even theaters and museums and so on. All the areas related with servicing the population have suffered, and they have received the necessary support from us. There was an entire package of measures which I will not go into detail about. We're talking about reduced rate loans and direct support measures aimed at preserving the jobs and the wages, and also the benefits and reduced rates for the loans and the delayed payments for the loans, the benefits for the rent payments. And by the way, we have extended certain measures, and we have always been allocating great resources from the federal budget to that end. The government is doing that deliberately, understanding the actual situation that we're facing. Sure, some things could be done more delicately or faster, but I would like to pay due respect for my colleagues. They are always maintaining direct contacts with the business community. You know that recently I was attending an event of the RSPP, and I was meeting the authorities and the leaders of the Russian industrial groups, including those who are working in the small and medium-sized businesses. But overall, people are quite understanding of the situation, and they have a positive evaluation of the government's efforts to support the businesses. By the way, the results are quite good. As I said previously, we have overcome the crisis faster than many of the world's economies. The decrease was more modest, and we have recovered faster. This is a good result, I believe. Now, speaking of the second part of your question, yes, exactly, the evaluation of the regional authorities. I have talked about this many times, and let me repeat, I believe you might agree, this was the way that was followed by many countries of the world. We were the first to say that our country is large and the regional situations may be different, which is exactly why we have the central authority from the federal center, we have the Federal Commission, which has decided to allocate some of the authorities to the regional level to make sure they have the opportunity to manage the situation in their own regions. We cannot compare Chukotka Peninsula and Moscow. These are totally different regions with different epidemic situations, since we have enormous geographical territories. Let me repeat, just like in any big undertaking, something could be done better, something could be done more delicately, but overall the regional authorities have shown themselves as very responsible people. they were not afraid of taking hard decisions. The government, the federal center, has always been supportive of the regions who were conducting the necessary steps and taking the necessary decisions. And when they needed support from the federal budget, they were receiving that multifold. The interaction between the federal center and the regions of Russia has given us the necessary results and outcomes. All right, let us move further. Let us take a question from the regions. Please do not yell. Oh, they will. All right. Let us take a question from a lady in a yellow vest with a sign saying City for Life. Please. Hello. I'm Lyudmila Danilkina from the city of Veliki Novgorod. Our city, which has been visited by you, Mr. Putin, many times, is quite small, but very beautiful with an ages-long history. And it is no accident that I mentioned the history of the city, since my question is partly related with the city environment. What city would you personally, apart from St. Petersburg and Moscow, would you choose to live in? This is the first part of the question, a personal one, I would say, and the second part is related with the Novgorod region. Our region is located very well between the two capitals, which is quite beneficial for the territorial development, but we have much more opportunities for development, and we would develop even faster if we had a high-speed railway track. There's been a lot of talk about that, both at the federal and the regional levels. And I would like to find out if there is any prospect in the implementation of these large-scale projects in our territory. Thank you. Okay. Speaking of the city I would like to live in, well, you mentioned apart from Moscow and St. Petersburg. Well, why did you exclude Moscow and St. Petersburg? They are also cities of the Russian Federation. I was born in one of them. This is my native city, which is exactly why. First of all, as you were asking this question, I was thinking about St. Petersburg. But we have a great number of small and large cities, and they are quite actively developing. But first of all, we must pay closer attention to the smaller cities. We have always been talking about this, and recently we've been taking great effort to develop the infrastructure. First of all, to make the links between the territories, using the railroad tracks, the car highways, as well as creating the air transportation, sea and river transportation. This is one of the drivers for the economic growth, and we will invest great resources for such developments. The links are the key. You may live in the conditions of a good environment and you might live well, and at the same time you must have an opportunity to reach your job or to change your job and transfer to another region. Improving the population mobility is one of our key priorities. And let me repeat. First of all, I was thinking about St. Petersburg, my native city, but the south is developing very well. Take a look at Krasnodar and the coastal region, Crimea, let's say. Now, moving back to the infrastructure, we're talking about the development of the Eastern Front. But apart from that, we also have Moscow and Kazan, as well as the other cities up to Tyumen. We're planning to reach the high-speed railways all the way there and then connect all the cities, giving the people an opportunity to feel connected in an affordable and available environment. Everyone must reach another place to meet their friends and colleagues, to reach their jobs, to reach other places which have other aspects of development. People must reach the museums, the cultural centers, and so on. Which is why I believe we have a great number of very beautiful and nice cities where everyone can feel comfortable. But speaking of the high-speed railway tracks, this is another topic which is currently under development. If we actually construct this railway track, sure, This will affect the city of Veliki Novgorod. Having a high-speed railway means you must have stops along the way, and Veliki Novgorod is one of the major places where the train could make a stop. And the airway connection will stop existing if we establish this high-speed railway track, since it would only take around 3 hours to go from the center of Moscow to the center of Petersburg. Sometimes it takes 1.5 hours to reach the airport in Moscow, which is why the aircraft are losing their meaning. So we must evaluate everything and consider all the options. Take a look at the experience of other countries in the construction of high-speed railways. Let's say the People's Republic of China has many similar railway tracks between the cities, and up until recently they were not profitable, even in China, meaning that this is a country with 1.5 billion people of population. We must calculate everything.
And of course, we understand that sometimes it makes sense to use railways, sometimes to use aircraft. Currently, the situation is being studied at the expert level. Alexander Gamov, were you the one who shouted out just before that? Yes, Komsomolskaya Pravda, yes. They will give you the mic now. No, I was not the one to shout out. Well, then ask your question. Thank you. Mr. President, thank you very much for coming here, because Dmitry Peskov told us it was your initiative. If you don't mind, I would like to get back to the topic that you raised when you spoke in response to Mr. Terekov's question at the very beginning of the press conference. You met our scientists and experts. So what do you think causes the new waves of coronavirus? Because every succeeding wave is stronger than the previous ones. So how certain are we of the vaccine's efficiency, and what are we to do with vaccination, revaccination, and why the mortality rates are so high? Because so far you haven't cited the figures, but every day around 1,000 people dies of coronavirus on a daily basis. And just recently, I made a terrible discovery. I looked at the mortality rates across the world. Every day, around 6,700 people die on a daily basis. So the figures are very high. Well, let's have a look at Austria, for instance, a democratic country. There are fines for people who have not got a vaccine. Maybe we could introduce criminal liability for those who urge other people not to go to see a doctor. You know, it's just occurred to me. I remember you said that Russia was in a difficult spot because it was being surrounded and all that. So we simply cannot afford it. We cannot afford thousands of people dying every day whenever we could, and we cannot afford that now. So maybe we need some political will on the part of the country's leadership, and we'll support you. Well, you said Russia was being surrounded. Was I the one to say that? Well, in the west, in the east, in the north, the new systems are being deployed, especially in the west. I think once we turn to international relations, we'll have a closer look at that. But of course, it's very difficult to surround Russia's territory, even though I think modern systems give grounds to believe that it is possible. Now, as far as new waves of coronavirus are concerned and the new strains, well, this is due to viruses' capability to mutate. The new virus mutates, so the answer is simple as that. And that is why new strains pop up. And these strains appear in those countries where there are some issues with healthcare systems, where the immunity level is low. Let's have a look at African countries, and some of them there is the problem with HIV, and that's why new strains can appear. It's no surprise. And that is why I say that it is very important to achieve mutual recognition of vaccines. We need to spread vaccines across the world as soon as possible and as abundantly as possible. Otherwise, we will not be able to overcome this issue on a global scale, and humanity will have to live with that and suffer terrible losses. We have this new term, excessive mortality. You know, it's just terrible. Now, as far as COVID mortality rates are concerned, they're difficult to calculate, and not because anyone tries to hide that. Far be it from me, for us. On the contrary, I call on our healthcare system to be as transparent, as open as possible. And I'll be quite frank with you. I want this transparency for people to understand how important vaccination is. So why do you have high mortality rates? Because we have a low level of herd immunity, 54.9%. The vaccination rates are not high. Our neighbors say that we need to hit 90%, more than that, whereas our rates are very low, 59.4%. So as far as criminal liability goes, I don't think we need to do that. And it's not about the political will. The thing is, any action brings up the proportionate reaction. If you start exerting pressure, you know, our people are very inventive, and they will devise ways to circumvent these attempts at exerting pressure on our population. And they will find a way. And that is why we need to follow another path. We need to treat our people with respect, regardless of their position. And we need to patiently explain to them the need for certain measures to be taken. Let's have a look at vaccination. You asked how scientists explain new incidences of contracting a disease after suffering a disease once. You know, it happens. Yes, there are people who already contracted a disease, and after some time they contract it once again. There are many media sitting here and in Russia and across the border say that just 1% of recovered contract the disease once again, and 3 to 4% of vaccinated people can contract a disease. So, of course, after vaccination, the disease is far milder. The consequences are not as severe, and we need to explain that to the people. In the Soviet era, no one bothered to explain anything to the people. They just made people take a jab. And you know, those who brought about the collapse of the Soviet Union right now are among the first to fight against vaccination. They share their doubts about the need for vaccination, but this is not an honest position. If people are well educated, if they are understanding, if they care about their voters, about people whom they have to protect, then they have to take a principled position instead of just, you know, veering here and there, trying to get a score out at the expense of the health of the nation. On the contrary, they need to treat people with respect. They have to explain to them the need to get vaccinated. And I think if this is the path we follow, then we will secure the necessary outcomes. Other measures are not going to be as productive. You asked whether we need to introduce harsher fines and measures for not getting vaccinated. Let's have Germany. The measures there are very strict, but you see the results are not that better. We need to fight infractions. If you try to fake a certificate, then of course responsibility will have to be taken. And I think there are 270 cases like that when certificates are being forged, and we have to fight that. And we also have to explain to people to raise their awareness. Yes, I don't think he's going to give the floor to BBC, so I will do that for you. BBC, please. Yes, please. Give the mic, please, to our colleague. Mr. President, hi, Piotr Kozlov, BBC Russian Service. Last year, Russia designated as extremist Navalny's headquarters, and Navalny is in prison. He conducted an investigation, and he said that he had found the people who had poisoned him. And there are more than 100 media in the list of foreign agents. Most of them made their way to this list over the last 6 months. So can you explain what happened in Russia that the number of foreign media has soared so high? And a couple of words about the history. You speak often about history. You remember history well, and you will probably remember that every time when in Russia, when authority was concentrated in the power in the hands of one force, and when Russia was in the stage of acute confrontation with the West, then it brought about a reaction, a plunge in the country into revolution and wars. So don't you think that having all the power in the country, you are laying the groundwork for such revolutions and wars? Yes, thank you. Speaking about history, I would like to remind you of what our opponents have been saying over many centuries. Russia cannot be defeated. Russia can only be disintegrated from inside the country, something which was achieved successfully during the First World War, or to be more precise, after the war, as an outcome of that. And then it happened in the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed. But who did that? Those who were servicing the interests of other countries, interests that are not the same as the interests of the Russian people and the citizens of Russia. You spoke about that person whom we allegedly poisoned. We sent many letters from the Prosecutor General's office asking for any evidence to corroborate his claims. Not a single evidence, not a single piece of evidence was provided. So what does it tell us? Not a single piece of evidence was given to us. About this Novichok. Well, we suggested that our experts go there, work with our counterparts. I made this proposal personally to the Chancellor of Germany, to the President of France. I asked them to provide us with a chance to send our experts, give us something to bring criminal charges. But no, not a single piece of evidence was given to us. Only silence on the other side. So I don't think we need to talk about that. Let's just turn the page if they can respond nothing to our queries. Now, as far as there's people in prison, you should not commit crimes trying to disguise that as political action. Now, the last question was about foreign agents and media on the list. This law is not something we came up with on our own. You currently act as a representative of the UK, and the UK is the closest ally of the US, and these countries are considered as beacons of democracy. In the US, adopted the similar law in the 1930s. It's not important that the law was adopted back then. The thing is, it's still in force right now. There's 0.34% of organizations have been designated as foreign agents. And, it's the same in Russia, just the same ratio, 0.34%. And there is a difference, however. There are criminal charges possible there if you are not in compliance with the law, and you risk up to 5 years in prison. And even if you do that, but it's too late, then there is the possibility of facing criminal charges and a sentence of up to 5 years in prison. Whereas in Russia, it's not like that at all. We just want the organizations who get funding from abroad and are active in Russia, we want them to be transparent about that. They have to declare that they get money from abroad. Our law is far more liberal. If you think that that is not sufficient, just as your colleague says that, criminal charges have to be brought against people who refuse to get vaccinated, well, we can introduce similar clauses into our law like the US, and if you do not close your activities and you get money from abroad, we can use the same measures as the US. But so far, the law is far more liberal. Yes, there are issues about some procedural matters. There are 74 organizations that have been designated as foreign agents out of 200,000 non-government organizations that are registered in Russia. Just 0.34%. But the measures against these organizations are not as harsh as in the US. Now let me move on to the separation of powers. We have 3 branches of power: the legislative, the executive, the judiciary, and in every country at different stages of the history there are some nuances to the cooperation, interaction of these branches of power. We need them to be separate. We need at the same time to make sure that our country is coherent, that it strives to move into the future. And of course, it is up to the Russian people to make a decision on the future of our country. It's not up to those whom you service today. Thank you. Let's move on. I suggest we should turn to TV channels now. Rather, Zinalova, please. There's no need to introduce yourself. Good afternoon, Mr. President, colleagues. We started to talk about history. It's just like Gorchakov said, Russia is concentrating, and of course we want to concentrate on our internal issues and address them on our own. At the same time, for the last several weeks, the foreign media are clamoring that Russia is preparing for war, that it threatens Ukraine with war. You give calls to foreign leaders, and you try to reassure them. As a result, you have to send your own proposals to them, rules of the game, red lines from our point of view. So in the past, it wasn't like that. Right now, we have come up with our priorities of our security, our interests, and of course, from history, we know that after any negotiations, agreements can stay on the paper. After negotiations, smallest provocation is enough for the agreements to be set aside. So, Mr. President, what are we to do? What are your realistic forecasts? And if they're clamoring about a possible war, do we consider such a possibility if a provocation happens or anything? You remember Gorchakov, you know, the beginning of his phrase, Russia is concentrating. But, you know, there was the first part of this phrase, of this quote. He was asked whether Russia was angry, and he said, no, Russia is not angry, Russia is simply concentrating. So let me give you a very succinct answer. You remember that the tensions started to flare up in 2014. Before 2014, despite the fact that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist and some parts of historically Russian territories with Russian population ended up outside Russia's borders in Ukraine, but we were okay with that. Moreover, we helped them build their countries, and we were willing to work, to cooperate with all governments, regardless of their political orientation. Let me remind you of our relationship with President Yushchenko and Prime Minister Tymoshenko, just as the current leadership of Ukraine. They were not shy about their pro-Western orientation. Yes, we had disputes with them about gas, but we managed to arrive at an agreement. So we were cooperating, and we were willing to continue that cooperation. And it even didn't occur to us to do anything about the Crimea. But what happened in 2014? There was a bloody coup d'etat. People were burned alive, they were killed. I am not speaking about who is to blame for that, however.
Well, there was some legitimate outcry of the Ukrainian nationals with respect to what was happening inside that country. And the then incumbent President Yanukovych agreed to that, and the three foreign ministers from Poland, Germany, and France provided guarantees for a peaceful development of the situation. I spoke back then with the US President. It was upon his initiative, and he asked me to back it, and everybody agreed, but then a coup occurred 2 days afterwards. Why do that? No response. President Yanukovych was in agreement. He caved in. He was ready to give up power as soon as the next day, and the victory of the opposition was inevitable. Everybody knew that, but why on earth do that? And afterwards, Crimea happened. Could we say no to those people residing in Sevastopol and Crimea? Could we fail to protect them? Well, we couldn't have acted otherwise. And or probably you believe that we should stand aside and watch what happened in Donbass. And, you know, Lenin and his comrades decided that Donbass should belong to Ukraine, and they created a brand new country that never existed, which is the Ukrainian Republic, and they pushed some of the historically Russian territories into that new republic back then, when the USSR was established. But back in 2014, we had to do something about that, and that gave rise to the crisis that has been evolving ever since. The Ukrainian authorities twice tried to